All right, so we're continuing on chapter 19, and we're looking now at the lower respiratory system. Now, this is slides 13 through 23, but I have started with a review. This particular slide, which was from the first video, is just where we divide up what's going on. And so we did it in looking at the dividing line between the upper and lower respiratory tract, and I said that the larynx is the dividing line. So the last video we stopped on the upper respiratory tract, and on this video we're going to look at the lower respiratory tract. So once we pass the larynx, we get into the area that we will call the trachea. Now the trachea, I'll switch this to black ink here. So the trachea here is going to be, the larynx had the thyroid and the cricoid cartilage. Once we get past the cricoid cartilage, we're going to get this tube that is got these semi-complete cartilaginous rings. They're like little C's. And we'll go over that in a minute. But that's called the trachea. The trachea is something that commonly is called the windpipe. I would know those two as being the same thing, but I would definitely know that we're talking about the trachea. It's going to extend, as it says, down from the larynx. It's going to be anterior to the esophagus. And once it comes down, it's going to divide into left and right primary bronchi. We'll talk about that again as we get there. It's lined with ciliated mucous membrane, which has goblet cells. And remember, at this point, we're talking about pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And these little C-shaped rings, there's 20 of them, is what I was talking about. These are hyaline cartilage rings. And the reason that they are C-shaped, and there's going to be a little muscle back here that helps it, is allow it to be able to flex somewhat and have a little bit of give, but also just behind it is where the esophagus is, so that when I swallow something, it doesn't rub against cartilaginous rings, which would be kind of annoying. So this is the look of those. You can kind of see again, this is the smooth muscle on the back here. And this part here is the cartilage, hyaline cartilage, a little ring. A cross-section of the trachea shows the C rings of the hyaline cartilage that keep it open. The pseudostratified columnar epithelium, which has cilia on it that lines the lumen. And that helps the goblet cells produce mucus. The cilia helps sweep things away. So if you are in a very dusty area, you will notice that you're kind of coughing up stuff and whatever, or pollen. The reason that our nose starts to run when we're not feeling good and we have a lot of phlegm is our body is trying to protect our lungs and producing a lot more mucus. Tracheostomy is when someone has some sort of damage and they are not able to the nervous system and they're no longer able to breathe, or some kind of choking is going on, and we need to poke a hole in the trachea, and that helps get area for gas exchange, for gas to get in. And this is kind of a big deal. I don't know if anybody here has seen one, but it's very disturbing if you don't know what's going on, but it is life-saving for someone who has got an issue. So now we get down, we've looked at the trachea here, so now we get down to this thing called the bronchial tree, and it literally is a tree. As the trachea comes down, it's going to branch right and left, and then those branches are going to branch, and then those branches are going to branch even more. And so it ends up looking quite tree-like as we start studying it. So anyway, and I should again have learned by now to quit trying to draw as much as I try to. I miss my whiteboard anyway. Once it branches to the trachea comes down, we branch into these primary bronchi. I'm going to have two primary bronchi because I have two lungs. Each primary bronchi will go into the lung that its side is on. Now this is the tree look of it. Again, if you were to put some leaves on some of these little things here, it would make a little bit more of an upside down tree-like look. But there's going to be a process of these bronchi or these tubes starting to get smaller and smaller. So we start with a right and left primary bronchi. As they go in, so again, this side is going to be the right, this side is going to be the left over here. As this goes in, and I'm going to get a different color for this now to kind of see if it helps. So it goes in, and it's going to branch. As soon as it goes into the lung, it's going to branch. And so as it does that, I don't know if that's going to work. As it does that, these branches are going to go into the lobes. And so the secondary bronchi is sometimes called lobar bronchi because they will branch and go into each lobe. Once the secondary bronchi get into the lobe, they will branch again. Now we look at these as called tertiary. In hospital settings in general, if you're going to go into respiratory therapy, they will be called segmental bronchi because each lobe is divided into segments. So it's right and left primary bronchi, and then lobar or secondary bronchi, and then once it gets into each lobe, they're called tertiary bronchi. Now, as we go through, we'll look at some of these other ones, but these are the three that I definitely want you to know, all right? And then the final result is the alveoli and the alveolar sacs. All right, so speaking of the alveoli, there's a picture of them. But this is going to be talking about the two parts of this, and I really probably should have had a different picture on this than this. This is what the book had, but when we start talking about the bronchial tree, all right, now again, I don't have a good marker here, so it comes down and it branches right and left, and then we're going to have all of these little steps until we get to this air sac, which is these guys, right? I know that doesn't look exactly like you would want. But this is going to divide the respiratory pathway into two portions. We have what's called the conduction pathway, which is this here. And then I'm going to jump down and talk about this one called the respiratory pathway. All right. These two are simply the dividing between the area where respiration takes place and the area where air is just being taken to that spot. So the conduction pathway, which is called that since, as it says here, since this is the transport portion of for the air, and there's no gas exchange, is going to be the entire bronchial tree basically, all the way until it gets to the alveolar. Now it says the respiratory bronchioles are going to be included in this, but it really is, this is the key, the alveoli, because the alveoli is where the gas exchange happens. And since this is where respiration, which is what the scientific name for gas exchange is happening, it is called the respiratory pathway or zone. Some books call it the respiratory zone and the other one the conducting zone. But it's simply saying that there's one area where respiration happens, and it's called the respiration pathway, and the other area, which is basically the roadway and getting that area to that, and it's called the conduction pathway. So when we start looking at the bronchi and the little tubes, they're going to continually get smaller. So we start off with the trachea, and it's got these pretty large C-shaped rings. They're going to have, in this In this trachea, the rings are pretty solid. Once it gets into the main bronchi here, those rings will turn into cartilaginous plates. So they won't be as structured like those C-shaped rings of the trachea. As the bronchi continue to branch and get smaller, the amount of cartilage decreases. So once we get into the small bronchioles, the cartilage is completely gone. All right. So as we go from the trachea on down to the alveoli, and these things get smaller and narrower, the cartilage changes from rings to plates to finally disappears. Now, on the other hand, smooth muscle becomes more prominent. Now, I want to make sure you understand that when I say that it becomes more prominent, what it's saying is it doesn't really increase as far as the amount that's there, but it appears to increase because as the tubes get smaller, there is more smooth muscle that makes it up. And so if I've got the trachea here, and I should have drawn a little C shape, forgive me, but it's got the smooth muscle around it or whatever. As we get to these small little bronchioles, it is mainly smooth muscle. And so while there's going to be more smooth muscle in this, the percentage is far greater in this. And so that's what it's saying. Smooth muscle becomes a more predominant tissue in it because of the fact it gets smaller. And it's going to be that way until it gets down to almost the very alveolar. So it gets down to the alveolar ducts, and then the smooth muscle disappears. So the respiratory tubes become thinner and thinner, and the type of epithelium changes as well. So if we go back and just kind of do a review before we get to the tissues, so cartilage is going to decrease. Smooth muscle apparently is going to increase. Now the cells are going to change. So the cells at first are going to go from these pseudostratified columnar epithelium cells that are going to be all over with the goblet cells in it. Then it's going to get a little bit smaller to simple cuboidal. All right. And then finally, it's going to get to the simple squamous. Right? So the cells themselves are going to kind of decrease in thickness, going from pseudostratified columnar to simple cuboidal to finally simple squamous. All right? So those are the structures of the respiratory tube and the way things work. Cartilage is going to decrease, smooth muscle will appear to increase, and the cells that line the tubes will get thinner. Pseudostratified columnar to simple cuboidal to finally simple squamous. And so these alveoli are the respiratory tubes in the alveoli, which is the area of respiration or gas exchange, and is the area of the respiratory zone. They're going to have these capillaries. Sorry, trying to organize my thoughts as I'm going through. Maybe I needed more coffee. But anyway, during gas exchange, oxygen is going to go from the air that's in our alveoli and jump across into the bloodstream, and the CO2 that's in the bloodstream is going to jump back out into the air. And so this is how the gas exchange is going to happen, and we're going to get more in depth in it as we go along. But right now, that's just the basics of it. So we're going to have capillaries are always associated with the alveoli because that is what is needed for the gas exchange. If I just have these little air sacs and don't have a blood supply next to it, nothing would happen. Now the lungs themselves, hopefully everybody has two lungs. There's going to be a difference between the right and left lung. The right lung is going to be a little larger and it's going to have 3 lobes, where the left lung is only going to have 2 lobes. Now, one of the big things is you're going to have a big structure that's going to be located right about here that we know of as the heart, right? And this is going to be, put the aorta, whoop, whoop, and then we got this one coming over here, and then whoop, whoop. All right, so that probably wasn't a good drawing, but that's the reason that the left lung is smaller is because of the heart being on that side. And that's what separates the lungs. And again, the heart is in the mediastinum. So again, remember the main thing on this is to know, I think that everybody here is going to know that the lungs are in the thoracic cavity and the heart's in the middle of it. But so the big thing here is to understand that the right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung only has 2. Now the lungs are going to have this little area called the hilum, the hilum. I might be mispronouncing it. I apologize. It is the area that's going to be on the medial surface, as it says, to where you're going to have the artery come in and the vein leave, and you're also going to have the bronchi come in. So this is the area of entrances and exits. And then going back to our 210 first lab, this is where you're going to find the pleural membranes. All right, the visceral membranes, I should say, the serous membranes, which is going to consist of a visceral pleura, which is going to be on the actual organ, and then the parietal pleura, which lines the cavity. And then the space that's between them, and again, I'll try to get a color that shows up real well in here. This space that is in here, this space is what is referred to as the pleural cavity. Now, that's important to know. A lot of people will try to think that this entire area here is the pleural cavity where the lung is, and that's not. It is simply the space between the visceral and parietal pleura, and it's important to know that. So this, to recap, is the parts of the respiratory system. It is going to include the upper respiratory down to the lower respiratory. The nose is going to be an important part. It is where the main area of breathing, again, just to recap, when you're breathing in areas, and right now, if you're out in the public and everybody's talking about masks and stuff, and whatever you do, one of the most important things is to remember to breathe through your nose if you are worried about catching something, because the nose, unlike the mouth, is designed to filter incoming air, and it does a very, very good job. The nasal cavity, again, is going to be the area where most of this is going to happen. Mucus, it's going to have a mucus lining. Then we have the sinuses. We talked about those. The pharynx, divided up into 3 areas again, but this is the shared tube inside the head that's going to have both a respiratory and digestive property. Then we have the larynx, which is the dividing line. The larynx, like I said, is the dividing line between the upper and lower respiratory tract. Now, once we get past the larynx, in the respiratory tract portion of it, we're looking at the trachea. Now, remember, in the digestive, we're looking at the esophagus. But now, in this chapter, we're looking at the trachea. The trachea is going to have those 20 C-shaped cartilaginous rings. Remember, hyaline cartilage. It's going to reach a point where it's going to divide right and left, and that's when we start the bronchial tree. Primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, until we finally get to the alveoli. And all of this is contained in the structure we call the lungs. So I hope that all helped.